My name is Jonah, and I worked the graveyard shift at a junkyard that most people only drove past when the sky was gray enough to hide the piles. Not the slick operation with forklifts and neon signs, but a sprawl of corrugated sheets and trailers where rust came in layers, and the wind smelled like old oil and sun-baked rubber. I was the kind of guy who checked for mice before I opened a crate, who learned to cup my hand and listen for anything that wanted to answer. I liked work without a clock. I hated clocks. The foreman, Hank, sat on the same overturned milk crate every morning, a baseball cap pulled low, a thermos that smelled faintly of cedar and gun oil. And he said the same thing whenever someone found something odd he wanted to claim as story. Another man's trash until the sun says otherwise, and we all laughed because the laugh was cheaper than admitting fear. There were rules, because the yard made rules for itself. Do not open the north lot after rain. Do not feed anything after midnight. Never carry mirrors alone. And if something hums on its own, pour salt water and call Rosalind. One week I went in to clear a collapsed trailer and found a bundle that looked like a pile of wires and cloth. It was nothing at first glance. It zipped at my wrist with a thin tin tooth, and I knew in a practical way that rules were not superstition. I will tell you what followed, how a trailer full of oddities changed how I thought about coming home. I was not always a junkyard man. I grew up 3 towns over in a house that smelled of lemon cleaner and the wood smoke my father brought in every winter. My childhood was the kind where you learned to count the cars on Main Street and the number of times the postman had to stop for our dog, and where my mother kept a box of things she could not throw away for reasons she couldn't explain. As a kid, I loved taking things apart, not out of malice, but to know their insides. Until my father taught me that every machine had a temper, and that temper could turn on you if you treated the wrong gears rudely. I apprenticed at a mechanic shop in my teens, learned to read metal the way some people read faces, and there was a time I wanted to work in clean places with clean orders. That shifted the day my sister left town and took with her most of what I thought of as home. After that, I worked odd jobs, salvaging scrap for a living, and for the solace of being near discarded lives. My turn came when I realized the yard was not only a place for metal. It collected edges of people's lives, frayed memories wrapped in tin and cloth. That idea lodged itself under my ribs like a seed. I had a fall where a hydraulic lift slipped and I nearly lost a finger, and that cut was the first real throb of knowing I could die on a scrap pile and be cataloged as an accident. The loss of my sister, the mechanic's steady hands, the accident, and the small comfort of handling objects that had stories made me what I was when I walked into that yard the night the bundle zipped my wrist. Those threads tied into what came next, because the yard did not just keep things, it kept marks, it kept habits, and it taught rules to those who stayed. The first incident started like work always did, with the clink of metal and Hank's low voice telling me to be careful around the southeast stack. I moved through aisles of stacked doors and dented hubcaps, with the air thick enough to taste of iron and wet cardboard. I found that bundle under a tarp that smelled of mildew and old perfume. I reached in and felt something feather light that then snapped against my knuckle like a child's toy made of tin teeth. Pain flared pale and sharp, blood and oil on my palm. I heard Hank call from the crate pile, "Jonah, are you poking at things again?" And I said, "It snapped at my hand, probably a spring." And he came over slow. Hank leaned in, smelled the bundle, frowned, and said, "That is not a spring. That is a locket wired wrong. Do you hear it humming?" And I realized the thing was humming like a throat clearing. Dolores walked up behind him, wiping her hands on a rag. She said, "Leave it be until Rosalind gets here. She has ways." And she looked at me the way people look at someone who does not yet know the depth of an old rule. Rosalind arrived with a satchel, wearing a scarf that always smelled faintly of clove and damp paper, and she whispered a line about names. Her fingers were steady as she bound the object in cloth and said, "You are lucky it was only a nip, for the yard remembers bites worse."
I kept my hand bandaged, and for the first time that night, the yard felt less like work and more like a set of waiting mouths. 1 month in, the CTA feels like a necessary pause because this is the moment I ask you, the listener, to join in. If you were standing where I stood, wouldn't your skin crawl just to feel that small teeth nip at your wrist, not knowing if it was human or machine or something in between? If you have ever found an object that seemed to hold a temper, begin your reply with "I found" and tell one line about what it did. Short answers help us gather patterns, and the best of your answers get collected. We read them before we go.
Out the next night. And sometimes they teach us a new rule. Share one sentence below, and you help map what these places keep. The next section will be about how the yard made rules and why we obey them. Rosalind, who everyone called Rosa, explained a little about how the place worked while she tied my hand with gauze stained brown. She said the yard was an olfactory map, that things kept scents of their owners and the emotions attached to them, and that when those scents pooled, they could act like a call. She named 5 entities by accident because the yard needed names to keep order. There were parasitic threads that nested in cloth and whispered at night, little collector cats that wore tiny pouches and stole the weight of memory, flower cadavers that fed on spilled hope and bloomed black in heat, objects that remembered the last touch and tried to recreate it, and echoes that hummed a tune you recognized from a childhood you did not want to revisit. Hank showed me the inventory protocol in a low voice with cigarette smoke curling. He said, "Load tags in triplicate, mark the smell, the time, and most important, never sell the lot with the green peg." And he ticked off names of past incidents as though they were invoices. May, the young clerk who loved old radios, wrote down the humming note in thin script and muttered about frequencies. Emmett, the tow driver, kept 2 shotguns in his trailer, though he rarely pointed them at people. He pointed them at things that moved when no one moved. Pastor Jim stopped by twice a month to sprinkle something that looked like blessed grain on the worst piles and to listen to the yard's stories as if they were confessions. All of them had rituals, and all of them respected a curved rulebook written in habit. The way they explained it made it sound mechanical, but the undertow beneath their explanations was that the yard had preferences, and those preferences could make people sick. The first real confrontation was the night the North Lot sang. I was on watch with Rosa and Emmett, and it started as a tremor in the gravel, a sound like a string being plucked under concrete. We stepped into a field of torn insulation and lightless trunks, fingers finding cold metal. Rosa whispered instructions for a containment she called a quiet cage, which was basically a ring of salt, a mirror, and a battery-powered radio tuned to static. Emmett said, "If it reaches the mirrors, it will try to look at itself, and you know the rest." And I banged a shovel for emphasis and felt the sound in my teeth. We baited with a pocket watch someone had left that hummed when wound, and it vibrated like a small heart. Then the singing changed. It took on syllables that made the hairs on my arms prick, and the pocket watch leapt like a living thing and struck the salt ring. For a long breath, I thought the watch would pierce the radio and crawl into the static, but Hank lobbed a jar of kerosene and we lit it. The flames threw shadows like hands, and the singing broke into a screech. Emmett shouted, "Hold the line!" And Rosa sang a line I did not know she knew, words that sounded more like directions than prayer. It worked, or it seemed to. The watch cooled and rolled still, and the lot stank like scorched paper and old gum. After that night, we bent more rules into rituals. That confrontation taught us that containment was a collection of small obediences rather than one big weapon, and that fear could be steadied into procedure. Inventory of peculiarities came next, like postcards from odd lives. Me found, stacked behind a dead refrigerator, a row of keys that sobbed when wet and would not fit any lock we owned. Carlos, the mechanic, found a set of dentures that laughed only on rainy days, and when you asked them a question, they answered in the voice of someone you loved and then forgot.
Dolores found a plant in a tin bucket that opened like a mouth and exhaled a warm breath that smelled like a child's lost sweater. And when you fed it metal, it sprouted silver seeds. Rosa once brought out a small wooden box that grew small shadows that could be coaxed to write odors into the air like letters. Lynn, the trailer mover, discovered a tape recorder that played the sound of a room you had wanted to return to, and every time you listened, the room felt closer, and a memory moved into the tape. Each of these vignettes came with instructions. Keys were counted in odd numbers. Dentures were wrapped in cotton and kept under a bell jar. The plant was fed pennies and spoken to in short sentences. The shadow box was kept in the dark until sunrise, and the recorder was never played more than once a week. We learned names and precautions, and we argued over labels in smoky conversations that tasted like burnt sugar. People from town, like Pastor Jem and a retired veterinarian named Rosa's second cousin Isaac, came by sometimes to trade stories and to watch the cataloging. The yard kept oddities like a museum keeps bad memories. Routine of protection was practical as any factory manual when you stripped the romance away. We swept paths of glass into marked trays. We had a rotation for the cameras that were mostly old lenses glued into housings. We kept jars of salted water for anything that hummed, and a small box of slugs tipped with silver for anything that pretended to be flesh. I learned to wrap objects in cloth that had been washed in coffee, because the smell of coffee seemed to muddle their preferences. When we fed the flour cadaver, we used a ladle. And a sieve to avoid splatters. We measured amounts of oil to throw into flames so the burn would be clean, and we recorded everything on tags with shorthand only Hank fully understood. Most days the work was boring, and the boredom was a blessing. Sometimes the routine failed in minor ways, like when May played a song near the shadow box and 3 of us woke up the next morning with a taste of salt in our mouths and a feeling of loss. Small failures taught humility, and small humility saved lives. The big confrontation came on a night thick enough to chew, when something from the east pile learned our frequency. The yard startled me awake with a noise like iron fingernails on a corrugated roof. Emmett was shouting, "Me, a channel!" and Rosa was already moving with a calm that was almost angry. We barricaded the main alley with doors from a stack labeled "Not for Sale," and Hank read rules out loud as if they were talismans. "Do not look it in the lamp. Do not let it touch your name." And he handed each of us a particular thing to hold. The creature, or whatever it was, came without a shape at first, a pressure in the air that made my teeth ache and made my lungs fill with the smell of old pennies. It learned to mimic, and it mimicked Hank's voice and me, and it said things that had been kept between people. It wanted to be invited, and Rosa and I knew the trick was to take away the invitation. We sang awkwardly, a litany of shouts and names that were real and ugly, and for a stretch of time everything was in motion. Emmett fired a blank at the ground, and the noise made it hesitate. We used a mirror as a trap because it liked to see itself repeating to infinity, and for a long minute it curled into the reflection like smoke caught by glass. Then Hank did something reckless. He threw his cap into the circle and shouted, "Take my place!" And the cap caught and flared with a light like a small sun, and the yard inhaled. I remember thinking then about the cost of bravery and the shape of sacrifice. Did Hank save us, or did he trade his part of the yard's ledger for time? The thing recoiled and disappeared into a seam between 2 trailers, leaving a smell of burnt leather and the sound of someone whispering apologies. We were left with a silence that pebbled the air and a burn on Hank's arm where the cap had been. We wrapped him in blankets, and he laughed like someone who had avoided answering something terrible. That laugh was a thin cover for what came in the morning. Consequences arrived like bills. Hank took a week off and came back softer around the edges, as if the yard had shaved something away from him. Dolores stopped whistling while she worked, and May started carrying a small recorder that she refused to play. The town noticed some things too. A neighbor who ran the thrift shop said more people stopped donating glass frames, saying they seemed to bring back arguments.
Pastor Jim told a strange, sober sermon about listening to empty places, and more people began to call in with things they had found in attics and told us they would rather we catalog them than have them in their living rooms. We collected a jar of seeds that the flower cadaver had sneezed and labeled them with a black marker and a date and put them in the freezer just in case. We gave names to new rules, and the yard kept humming at night like a throat that needed clearing. Some items were locked deeper, behind boxes labeled "Do Not Open" and tagged with a green peg that none of us dared to remove. 1 month after that night, I stopped going straight home. I found excuses, like stopping for a soda or helping a friend, anything to keep the walk through the yard in my periphery. 3 months later, I had set up a small shelf in my trailer with objects I did not fully understand, but could not let go of. I kept a pocket watch that no longer hummed, a jar of seeds, and a little mirror that showed the ceiling of a house I had never lived in, but that felt like home. The act of not going home became a ritual. I would watch the road from the trailer window, and if I saw a shadow move like a person, I would wait 5 minutes, because the yard taught patience. I started sleeping in a cot in the workshop 1 night every week. People from town began to bring us trinkets with stories, and we started a ledger labeled Offerings and Pleas. 6 months after the incident, the yard had a stranger who came by at dawn with a battered accordion. He said his name was Carlos, and he wanted to pay for a place to trade songs for items. We let him in under supervision, and he taught us a song that made the air thinner for a moment and then clearer, like breathing after a box is opened. The song seemed to stitch small holes shut. The yard was changing the people who stayed with it, like a slow weathering. Today, I almost never go back home. My trailer smells faintly of coffee and metal polish, and sometimes of a child who once lost a shoe. I have friends who ask me if I miss living with someone else, and I say I miss the idea of a kitchen table, but I do not miss the guarantee of a house that will keep me the same. Hank fixed up a small bench by the east lot and sits there with his thermos and his slow song.
Sayings. And Dolores has a collection of cloth tied around a beam to catch loose words. Me and Emmett have an odd partnership where me catalogs sound and Emmett secures doors with a care that looks almost tender. Pastor Jim comes every fortnight to listen and to fold small coins in his palm. Rosalind is the keeper of names, and she keeps a velvet bag of tags that smell like clove and lemon, and she will not let anyone take those tags out of the yard. They are all part of the ledger now. I keep a box at my trailer door with a red ribbon where I put 1 item I find every month as a kind of offering, a gift to the yard and to the idea that some things must stay cataloged somewhere between memory and ruin. Sometimes a neighbor waves from his porch and says, "You will come home eventually," and I want to say maybe, but instead I hand him a small metal seed and tell him it is for his garden and that it will grow in strange ways if he feeds it patience. I have learned that the yard is not evil in the simple sense, and it is not kind either. It keeps, it teaches, it demands small sacrifices, and pays back with explanations that are mostly practical and sometimes hard. If you follow this work, if you listen to the hum in your attic, remember to wrap the thing in coffee and salt if it sings, and to call a name older than yours before you try to sell it. If you have a story, start your answer with "I found" and leave 1 line. We pick the best, and they become part of how we live with places that keep things. For now, I will say that the yard has become my home more than any house ever was. There is a strange comfort in returning to a place that expects you to change. And there is a promise I keep telling myself at night when the wind smells of solder and rain: I will go home one day, but until then I will learn the rules and keep the ledger, because some things are safer cataloged than carried alone.